I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you for joining me on April 2nd, 2020. I hope everyone is doing as well as they possibly can be during this time. It feels like only a month ago the world was completely different. In the last few years, to me, and I know to a few other people, it seemed like maybe this is what the world would be like if Lex Luthor became president, as he did in the comics at some point. And then a lot of other people will say, no, Lex Luthor was a brilliant person. It's nothing like that. I've been thinking a little bit about supervillains. In the last month, it's definitely seemed something more in line with the Joker, maybe even Darkseid or one of the other powerful villains who can come up with a diabolical scheme to keep people apart, to hurt the most vulnerable, and to make it possible to avoid some of these things, but only if the dumbest and most selfish people are willing to play along, which they obviously aren't in many cases. So yes, it's a strange time. To me, it seems like the perfect time to interview Robert Peaslee and Robert Weiner from Texas Tech University. They have previously been the co-authors and editors of The Joker, critical essays on the clown Prince of Crime, as well as Web-Spinning Heroics, critical essays on the history and meaning of Spider-Man. And the book we're talking about today is The Supervillain Reader, that collects a number of authors writing about popular culture from a critical cultural studies point of view, as well as a number of others, film studies, religious studies, and many other points of view thinking about supervillains. And so I'm very happy to be speaking with them. I did record this prior to the craziness that has been March and early April in 2020, and so just to note, we were talking long before people really understood what the coronavirus meant for the world. So without further ado, let me introduce Robert and Rob. Maybe you guys can introduce yourselves, actually, say a little bit about what you've been doing and working on, and the Supervillain Reader. And thank you again, guys.
I'm Rob Weiner, popular culture librarian at Texas Tech University, and the author and editor and co-editor of 15 books, as well as numerous articles, all related to popular culture. Things such as Monty Python, James Bond, Spider-Man, Marvel Comics into film, Grindhouse movies, and so forth.
I'm Rob Peaslee. I'm the chair for the Department of Journalism and Creative Media Industries at Texas Tech University, and have co-edited a number of things with Rob, written a number of articles in other fields, most consistently in the area of media anthropology, relationships between media, place, and space, things like screen tourism and media festivals.
Again, thank you for speaking to me today about this book in particular, The Supervillain Reader. Let's maybe begin with talking about why it's important to study and think about, in a critical way, supervillains.
Well, because, in its most basic form, without the villain, there's no real story. And I think we can live vicariously through villains, but not actually have to be one. We find villains fascinating, but certainly nobody really wants to meet the Joker in real life,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think obviously the Joker is a great example of a supervillain, perhaps the best example of what we mean by a supervillain, but also, in a way, kind of the most tricky of the examples because of the changeable nature of that character. And one of the things that I think supervillains do over time, as we see how they're deployed over the course of many decades now, we can also see how they perform different functions and narratives depending on what's going on in the sort of cultural or historical moment. Supervillains, I think, are, in a way, kind of a divining rod for finding out what scares people at any given moment and how they choose to engage that thing that scares them in a pleasurable way.
Yeah, and as you point out in the book, and as the various authors who have contributed to it point out, not all superheroes and not all villains are created the same. Some have proposed different ways of categorizing them. Maybe you could say a little bit about the categories or the ways of identifying types of heroes and villains that you found most helpful in critical scholarship and even just reading comics or watching movies? What are the sort of forms villains can take?
There's a few different taxonomies that we engage with in the book, again, through our contributors. They kind of map over each other, but I think the differences in terminology are important in terms of seeing some of the shading, I guess, between some of these categories. But, I think the primary taxonomy would sort of position a villainous character along some continuum where, you have kind of this cartoonishly, chaotically evil sort of character that is, sort of out for world domination, or just, it's not even kind of really clear what they want, but they're just straight up evil. And then you have very sympathetic villains like Magneto, who have a very clear reason for doing what they're doing and are often doing bad things for what they see as good reasons and what we can sometimes see as good reasons, or sometimes doing sort of good things for bad reasons. Somewhere in there or somewhere outside of that continuum maybe is anti-hero and anti-villain characters that we sort of love in similar kinds of ways when we encounter them in narrative, but obviously perform different functions ultimately in terms of how the story resolves.
How is it then different, perhaps, or maybe it's not, when you're doing something like a Supervillain Reader as opposed to what you might approach a heroic reader or a superheroes reader? I mean, I know some of that work is out there. You two have contributed to some of that work. Does it change when you're dealing with supervillains, or would you say it's basically the same approach?
No, it's a different approach because, supervillains do not necessarily have to deal specifically with sequential art in comics. Our book has villains related to Shakespeare or Godzilla or Buddha's original superfoes. So the supervillain predates the superhero, and it's a minute distinction, but I think is a very potent one. And one of the things Dr. Peaslee and myself wanted to do in the onset of this project is make sure that we cover sequential art in comics, but that we go beyond that and truly look at all aspects of villainy.
And I guess I would add that we've done previous edited collections in the past. We did one on Spider-Man. It was kind of our first collaboration, which I guess you would sort of say is the model we would have for doing this around a superhero character. And the number of abstracts we got for that, I think, was substantial. Everybody's got a Spider-Man angle, and everybody, if we did a Superman reader, I'm sure would have kind of a Superman angle, because people think about those characters a lot. It's only recently, maybe the last decade or so, that people have really started to think about their relationship to the supervillain. And I think it took a minute when we first put the call out for people to sort of, it wasn't like they had an article like ready to go in the hopper, like finally there's a supervillain book, I'm going to send this in. I think it provoked people to consider some issues or some character elements seriously, in some cases maybe for the first time. That's obviously very exciting for editors when we're able to, we think, to sort of make that kind of provocation.
It is interesting that, recently with the Joker film and the challenge of dealing with U.S. politics and a number of other things that are on people's minds in the social contexts in which we might be reading comics or watching films, there is, it seems, a turn towards villains or towards thinking about villains. What are the risks involved in that? You mentioned this in the book, of course, but there's a strange relationship we have to villains, because a hero we might want to emulate completely if we could, whereas a villain, most of us hopefully don't want to emulate that, and yet there is a sort of identification, even sort of a holding up as exemplary in some cases, perhaps. What are the risks involved in sort of portraying villains and taking villains seriously as perhaps people we might want to consider in relation to ourselves?
As I mentioned earlier, the villain provides a way to live vicariously through the villain, through the story, but you don't want to emulate. You don't want somebody to actually go out and do the things that villains do necessarily. Apparently the Joker has become a symbol worldwide for kind of an anarchistic ideology. And, my response to that is you are responsible for your own actions. You can't necessarily say you're emulating the Joker or Magneto or, Dr. Doom or anything like that. I think it's important to have sort of a fine line. We love villains. We're fascinated with them, but we don't want to become them.
Well, and you mentioned the Joker movie, I guess Joker, not the Joker movie. And it's a really interesting case study because I don't know that we have another case where a film that was was received so ambivalently by so many different audiences made that much money.
Yeah.
And that is really interesting to consider. A, what are the reasons that it was received ambivalently? What were people's either explicit or implicit difficulties with the film? And then, despite all that, why was it as wildly successful as it was? For A, why do people have difficulty with the film? Some of that was just based on its reputation and the way it was being marketed prior to release. A lot of people had difficulties with it before anybody had even seen it, based on its association with gun violence and things like that, but also because it portrayed an angry white man, and that was clear in the marketing, that was going to be sort of the premise, right? But then once people saw it, I think we come back to Chris's original question, because what Joker makes you do is not just be fascinated by the villain, but live in the villain's skin for the whole movie. You can't escape it.
You can't.
And in most cases, you can have dalliances with the Joker or, the other villainous characters, but you always have the hero to fall back on. And you always know somewhere that you're just playing in your identifications with the villain, because you always have the hero who's the real point of identification. In Joker, you're not given that. You have two choices. You can disengage from the film entirely, or you can revel in the transformation of that character, the realization of that character's full potential in a very traditional 3-act arc kind of way, in the same way that you would with the origin story of a superhero. And I think that made people, whether they knew it or not, that was the reason why they felt this way. They were very uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think along with that, and this story goes back, for as long as people have been studying media and communication and narrative, there is a sense that if you show Joker and you don't show him getting beaten by Batman, then you are effectively condoning that behavior. You're saying this is what we should be emulating, or at least this is what we are supporting, whether that's the director, the actor, the audiences, simply because you're showing this content without the sort of old school comic books code, villain dies in the end or villain is put in prison in the end. And I think something similar could be at least a concern for you two when you're working on the Supervillain Reader, is that simply in talking about supervillains, it seems like you're saying this is what we are saying you should do, which of course I'm not saying you're doing that, but in simply just showing villains. A lot of people confuse that, or at least equate that with supporting villains. How do you negotiate that, whether as an audience watching a film like The Joker or what have you, or also in collecting a reader like this, like the Supervillain Reader?
That's a good question. I think we grappled with that a lot when the Joker book came out in 2015, because as we were just about to send that off to the publisher. Like, we were in the final revisions on our introduction and stuff before we sent that out to the University Press in Mississippi. And during that time, the shooting in Aurora, Colorado happened, which, had that connection to the Joker character. I had a moment where I sort of had to think about that a little bit. What, on the one hand, does publishing a book on the Joker in that case, what kind of attention does it draw to the character that could be misconstrued as, again, sort of valorizing the character or promoting the character as a point of identification, etc. But on the other hand, would it be complete dereliction of duty to not take that character seriously and to not publish what at that time was the first full monograph, length, or not monograph, but full book length engagement with that character? That is in some ways the question that faces directors or creators of any kind that deal in characters and topics that are troubling in some way. And it comes back to the life emulating art or art emulating life question, I suppose. I think as scholars, we have a slightly different relationship to that problem than creatives do. It's not completely dissociated, but certainly much of the discourse that was surrounding Joker previous to its release was various parties sort of speaking out to or toward Todd Phillips and Warner Brothers and other partners on kind of the creative corporate side. And, at the core of much of that criticism, I think, was an ideology about that responsibility. You have a responsibility to treat this character a certain way, and if you don't, you're culpable for what happens next. And I don't know. I don't think that's completely wrong, but I also think that that lacks a certain amount of nuance as a position.
Yeah, and this is my last Joker question for now, at least, because I don't want to just hark on Joker, but I try to avoid the reviews before I see a film if I know I'm going to see it, and so I try to avoid Joker stuff before that movie came out. Nevertheless, I had an impression just based on headlines and other things that if I like the Joker film, then I am to some extent supporting groups like incels and these sort of horrible groups that somehow, at least in the criticism, became associated with, again, that angry white guy who is, not in a relationship but wants to be, and who is associated in some ways with shootings that have happened in America. And so obviously I don't believe that going to and appreciating the film is supporting this group. I guess, how do you weigh those or negotiate those discourses that are floating around? Like, do you think it's required sort of to say, I love this film, if that's the case, but I condemn these acts? Or do you think we should be able to separate them without having to explicitly do so? I mean, maybe that wasn't your impression, but my impression, at least before I went to the film, was if I like this, or if I say that I like this, I'm associating myself with some horrible people. How do you sort of negotiate the links that have been formed regardless of whether we want them to be?
That's a tough question. I personally never felt that way. If I enjoy the Joker film, it doesn't necessarily mean I support any of these horrible groups. You cannot, in my view, make art responsible for the actions of somebody else. I always go back to personal responsibility, that individuals are responsible for their own actions.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've only seen Joker once, and I want to see it again because I usually, as most of us do, get a lot more out of a film the second or third time I see it. But what I came away from that film with was not so much a valorization of the downtrodden, angry white man trope, as much as a critique or an indictment of a society that leaves people behind. Mm-hmm. That there are, in this case, obviously spectacular, but in all cases, less spectacular consequences for a society that does that. To me, that was the social critique that, for me, made the film valuable. I didn't love the film. I thought it was fine as a movie. It's a relatively simple, straightforward film. The performance is obviously the centerpiece, and for my money, the score as well. But it's not the sort of film that I feel like I need to see over and over again, the way I feel about The Dark Knight, for example.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But Joaquin Phoenix obviously brought something to that role that we hadn't seen before, which is no small task, and couched it in our time in a way that I think will remain unforgettable. So I don't know, like, is the critique that I think is in that film, as I described it, worth the risk that somebody will miss the critique and just say, oh, I identify with that character, so, I'm going to pursue a similar course of action? I guess I think it is. And I think I'm saying the same thing as you, that, ultimately art needs to engage with what it feels it needs to engage with. Yeah. And then personal responsibility doesn't cover everything else. But it is sort of down to literacy, right? Being able to understand that what you're seeing in front of you is a fictional narrative, and it has this both a market intent and also this artistic intent sometimes. So yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one, Chris.
Yeah. Well, let's build on that a little bit then. You could definitely say that, we should be, or, legally we are responsible for our own actions. And it's never really worked, even though it's been tried sort of in courts in the US and elsewhere, I believe, to blame it on the video game or on the film that you saw or on the music that you listened to. It never really works. And so it is a personal responsibility. And yet, you guys are studying popular culture. I do too. You guys are writing about supervillains and these films and these comics and such. If they didn't have any influence on people, or if they didn't relate to people, I don't want to say necessarily influence, but if they didn't relate to important things, and if it was all based on our individual ideas and identities, then it doesn't seem worthy of study, right? So what makes this stuff worthy of study in your mind then?
Well, I guess just, again, I know we want to jump off into other things besides Joker, but again, if I just take...
No, it's okay. We can... He is one of the main forces, I suppose.
Yeah. In that film, like I said, the real antagonistic force in that film is not Joker. It is, sort of these systemic and institutional forces that, in a variety of different ways, fail him. And I don't think Rob believes, I don't think you believe, Chris, that, anybody walks in to a movie or buys an album or watches a YouTube video and suddenly they're a different person or they have a different agenda or, they feel demonstrably different about something. It takes time. And it takes repetition, and it takes a social situation where, that individual is not provided with any other kind of influence, right? So parental, social influence with friends or associates, teachers, if people are in a vacuum and they're exposed to something over a relatively long period of time, eventually, they will potentially think differently about something. And so I think these things are worth studying for a couple of reasons. One, they help us understand maybe the process of alienation, how people can feel removed from society, how they can see themselves as the hero of their own story, working against a villainous culture or institution that has, wronged them and others in some way. It helps us understand perspective. Again, not necessarily take on that perspective, hopefully not take on that perspective, but understand it, even empathize with it in an attempt to ameliorate some of those conditions, either through, study or through activism or through politics or however one chooses to engage. And of course, it's also just interesting and valuable to interrogate these texts from a purely sort of formal perspective. How are these media forms evolving, characters evolving, and, how are the tools of the trade changing given technology and industry changes and audience changes and behaviors and things like that?
There are many, many ways that we could approach the study of popular culture, but also the study of supervillains. You have many in this book. What have you found most helpful, whether that's a narratological approach, critical theory, a philosophical school of thought? Out of the many that exist and continue to be developing, what have you guys found most helpful in terms of theoretically or methodologically approaching the subject?
You have any thoughts on that, Ray?
Well, as I said earlier, without the antagonist, you've got no story. Villains are often so interesting. They're fascinating to watch, even though you don't necessarily root for them. It's kind of like that scene in Psycho where the lady's just been killed and Bates takes the car and it doesn't quite go under the water.
Mm-hmm.
For that brief moment, you're sympathizing with Bates. Then you have to think to yourself, what are you doing? He just killed someone.
Yeah, so I tend to approach most of what I do, at least through a broadly ethnographic lens. A lot of the work that Rob and I have done together has been, I would say, more textual in nature. I haven't done a lot of audience work with regard to these particular texts. Some of my first questions would be sort of through a lens of kind of a media anthropology frame. How are different audiences with different demographic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, engaging with a particular text of this kind? What kind of meanings are they drawing from it? And that can be transmedia in terms of like how do people engage with a Joker across different media forms? What kind of language or discourse are they falling back on to sort of describe their experience with those characters? I mean, I think with Joker and probably several other characters, there are interesting critical theory points of entry there through Foucault and notions about power, knowledge, nexus, and how we decide people are deviant and what the consequences are from that. In distinction to the supervillain, a superhero who is also deviant in many ways is somehow, not a threat or is valorized in a variety of different ways. There's interesting queer and gender feminist approaches to these characters in many cases. Mm-hmm. The notion of the monstrous and the approach that these characters are ciphers for, maybe in a psychoanalytic sort of way, for the unmentionable or unapproachable fears of mainstream American or Western pop culture. So, I guess those are places to start, but obviously there's a lot more there as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a huge subject matter, and actually that makes me think maybe we should take a step back and get you to sort of define a supervillain, because you do make the distinction between, obviously, villains and heroes, but also between regular villains and supervillains and what that might mean. I think it's also interesting that you go from ancient Sumerian texts like Gilgamesh to, again, the Joker from 2019. Part of me wants to say, like, how can you possibly compare those things? But then another part, especially when reading it, it makes perfect sense. So maybe you could say how you work with that definition, and maybe it's not a perfect scientific definition, but what are we talking about when we talk about supervillains, and how are those distinguished from other sorts of characters? And on top of that, how has it possibly changed over time, or is there a sort of unifying principle that unites thousands of years of storytelling?
Well, I think in its basic, simplest form, the villain is proactive and the hero is reactive.
And what makes a villain super, again, in its most basic form, we probably go back to the various manifestations of the Satan character.
Yeah, I was just thinking that myself.
Yeah, the antithesis of whatever we feel to be the greatest good in, whatever cosmology. The superhero sort of is a god on Earth in many ways. So therefore, the supervillain takes the opposite role. And like Satan, often has a story to tell that isn't just I'm a bad man.
Yeah.
It's there's a rationale.
A rationale, right? and it's oftentimes much more complicated.
Yeah, than the heroes is.
Than the heroes is.
Yeah.
Not always, obviously.
But I guess if there was a unifying theme for us as we were looking at, what are we going to include in this book? Like what counts? We rather than sort of creating a canonical or authoritative definition of the supervillain, we wanted to sort of show, like a well-trodden path through history, right? That might not be a single track,
Yeah.
But it has maybe little diversions or places where fewer people have, there's fewer footprints or whatever. But if you look at it, you can see that there's a discernible sort of through line there. And our approach was to sort of think of that in terms of myth and religion, early, kind of classical literature, Shakespeare and so forth, and then up through film, television, and comics. And to, the unifying thing, I guess, that when we saw an article that we were like, yep, that fits, was, does this piece help us understand the nature of that well-trodden path more fully? And maybe even define some of its contours, even if we can't define the thing itself with any authoritative, unwavering certainty.
Yeah, and I feel like, as with any good text, as with any good study, there are far more nuances that you, as a reader, probably aren't aware of until you pick something up like this. And I would think maybe ahead of time, of course, I know what a supervillain is. It's simple. How can you have 200 or 300 pages to talk about that? And yet, as you go through it, you realize, wow, there are a lot of nuances about supervillains, just as there are about a number of things that in popular culture especially can seem really easy and superficial, and yet there's all these layers that scholars can point out and demonstrate in their work. What do you wish, or what would you like to see people pay more attention to? Maybe nuances within the dynamic of heroes and villains, but what is missing from a sort of cursory glance at some of these works?
That's a good question. I mean, one of our favorite pieces in the book, I think, is Kate Mongrain and David Perlmutter's piece on henchmen. That was one of those when, as soon as we saw the title, we were like, yes, that needs to be in the book, because nobody ever talks about these characters, and they're so part and parcel of these stories. And as that piece shows, all the way back to antiquity. I think it would be a welcome emphasis in, the kind of work that we and folks like us do to sort of engage with the characters that surround the supervillain. And we're seeing that a little bit. I mean, Birds of Prey, these texts that aren't necessarily about one character, even if one comes to the fore, it's more about how they collaborate with other characters. But even then, that doesn't really get at what is the nature of the cult of personality around supervillains. Why do they attract people to their antisocial or sociopathic causes? Again, I think that's one of the things that Joker they don't linger over it for a long period of time, but I remember as I'm watching that film at some point saying, that's how he gets henchmen. That's why people work with him, even though they understand that it's probably not going to end well.
Yeah, the Joker rarely pays, and very often you won't live through it being a henchman, and you certainly won't, like I said, get paid, or a hench person, I should say.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess so. What are the mechanisms that surround the kind of personality of the supervillain? How does that help us understand maybe other parts of public and political life, and how cults of personality develop around people in our everyday lives?
Yeah, it actually makes me think of the sort of arguments that have been happening a lot with heroes that we need more diversity in order to show not just a, strong straight white guy who's the hero, but to show a more diverse range of heroes. And so Wonder Woman, Black Panther, Birds of Prey, all of these have been touted as great representations or a step in the right direction. But in some of the work I've been doing, I came across this, and maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, a petition called Make Joker Gay Again. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
No.
Okay, well, I found this in some of the research I was doing because I've been working on Batman and Joker, but there was basically a petition online, signed by a couple, I think 100,000 people, or at least in the thousands, saying that the Joker has always been sort of represented as queer, but never officially. And this person thought that it would be a good step for queer representation to have the Joker officially come out. And it's an interesting concept because I think there is a lot of argumentation about why we need more than just the basic, straight white guy superhero, because that gives people somebody to look up to, particularly, if you're an African American, and it's kind of nice to see an African American superhero. Do supervillains work in a similar way or differently? Because, of course, with me, when I came across that petition, it would be good to have representation and diverse representation, but then there's also the history of queer villains showing how bad queer people are, right? Like James Bond villains, for example, the gay ones are always the bad guys who get punished in the end, and that was there's a long history of that, as well as racial minorities. If you go earlier in film, there's a step to try to get away from minorities in particular as villains. Brings up a number of questions, I guess, about what villains do. Like, is it good to have a gay villain because that's showing progress, or is it bad because that's kind of going back to the 60s anti-gay movements? So I guess my question is, how do villains work? And, do you think a gay Joker would be good for the LGBT community or potentially bad, or is it simply not that straightforward?
I don't think it's that straightforward, although I think a gay Joker would be quite interesting. And certainly in some of the portrayals, like Cesar Romero, you can definitely see some homoeroticism there. His old portrayal in the old Batman series. If we've got gay heroes, why shouldn't we have gay villains? I think representation of all kinds is a step in the right direction.
One of the pieces in our book is a reprint of Philip Lamar Cunningham's piece from, I think, 2010, which he titled The Absence of Black Supervillains in Mainstream Comics. Mm-hmm. And he kind of takes this on early in his piece, sort of the discourse that why would we want black supervillains? Why do we need to see more, particularly black males, portrayed as bad guys in media? He recognizes that what he's arguing is sort of counterintuitive, to that social problem and its resolution. And he says, yeah, there's plenty of black bad guys, but I want a black supervillain. I want somebody who's a badass, who got superpowers and who is like super smart and is has a master plan and has a complicated backstory and a rationale for what they're doing, and not just a street thug or a drug dealer or, a gang member or, even somebody that might have kind of super strength, but that's kind of it. Obviously, we found that to be a compelling question or argument because we included it in the book. And I could imagine somebody writing from an LGBTQ perspective with a similar proposition. Whether the Joker is, the right real estate to claim there, I don't know. I mean, he's so chaotic as a character and so malleable,
malleable
from one
very much so.
Iteration to another. I mean, I certainly think I would watch that or read that for sure. And obviously, as you mentioned, it's been alluded to in many iterations of the character here and there, particularly in his relationship with Batman. Mm-hmm. But, if you take Phil Cunningham's argument to heart, then there could be something empowering about a gay Joker who, brings to the table all the raw power that the Joker brings because of his radical freedom and because of his chaotic nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting and sort of provocative thought with both that article in the book as well as other things that have been circulating about representation. Is there anything that you think, I don't know, maybe this could help for creators, but maybe it could also help for critical scholars? Anything that you think in terms of direction for new movies, new content, new comics, what have you, where you'd like to see villains go, whether that's in terms of, I don't know, aesthetics or background or what have you? Is there anything that you think is less played out that you would like to see more of, or maybe a direction you've seen hinted at that you would like to be explored further?
Well, I haven't seen Birds of Prey yet, and I know that's an astonishing admission, and I'm sorry.
I haven't either, though.
But from what I understand, it might be the most successful so far kind of villain team up. Villain team ups have been really fun in comics and sequential art for a long time,
but not so much on the screen.
Right?
Have they worked?
Yeah, they had. I mean, again, Birds of Prey maybe has cracked the code, but Suicide Squad sure didn't.
No, it didn't.
And that was the second most disappointed I've ever been in a movie theater, was when I realized where Suicide Squad was headed. And
I gotta just ask what the first was, or else it's gonna bother me.
The first time I saw the Phantom Menace.
Okay.
Yeah, about 40 minutes into the Phantom Menace, my heart just kind of fell out of my chest and onto the floor of the movie theater.
Yeah. But, okay, are we also comfortable then saying that Suicide Squad and Birds of Prey are definitively a sort of villain or supervillain team up? Because they're sort of the protagonists in the films as well. Right.
And so, yeah, that calls into question the ability for us to use protagonist and hero as synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, as again, those films potentially and certainly Joker indicate the protagonist can be somebody who is not traditionally heroic.
Heroic, yeah.
Although, in the case of Joker, you would certainly say that there are hero moments in that film.
One of the things, we keep coming back to the Joker movie and Joker as a character, which is fine. And I've said this for years, and the Joker movie proved it, that the Joker is just as likely to let you live as he is to kill you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because he's not necessarily an agent of evil. He's an agent of chaos.
Chaos, yeah.
And, as another contemporary example that's been very prominent in pop culture and especially in cinema, we have a character like Thanos, who not a lot of people knew prior to the onset of the MCU, and really not until late in the cycle of MCU films. If people weren't really comic fans, they didn't know who Thanos was. And Thanos, again, as a character, has a rationale and a backstory and a heart. There are moments, I think, where you're encouraged to feel sad for Thanos, right? For the tragedy that is his myopia and what he has to give up in order to follow what he sees as the right path for him. I think that makes movies and stories generally more interesting than just a murderous sort of villain character that you can't tap into anything in terms of their why.
Like Jason.
Yeah, I mean, that's fun, but that's more like a roller coaster, right? It's more like a thrill, like thrill ride. But if you really are in for narrative, then those characters having some depth and some dimension to them is a good thing. But it disturbs the binary between hero and villain, because it either completely or partially unsettles that easy association between protagonist and hero.
Yeah, I think as we go further into the new movies coming out with Marvel and DC and just popular culture in general, maybe we are at, well, I want to know what your opinion is, but maybe we are at sort of peak villain right now. Maybe we have sort of focused in on villains, and people are going to look back 20, 30 years and remember how much or how many villains were at the forefront. Is that sort of what you see, or do you see this as a larger trend that, is going to last longer? Or maybe it's almost the same as it ever was with Shakespeare and so on. It's simply that, we're paying attention to it with books like these. What do you think about trajectory over the long term? Are we seeing lots more villains and that's going to go away when we start getting tired of that, or what?
Well, I thought superhero movies were going to go away about 5 years ago. So I don't know if I'm a good fortune teller when it comes to that. But
yeah, I thought they were going to go away 10 years ago.
Yeah.
We were saturated then. So, yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is the media forms themselves are changing. If you think about the ways that we used to engage on screen, at least with villains, it was either in the context of a 90 to 120 minute story or a 22 or 48 minute story. And those stories were self-contained for the most part. And they were basically 3 to 5 act structure, depending on film or television. And they were, okay, here's a villain of the week, or, here's the antagonist for this story. And that, the story is about how we defeat that antagonist, right? But with the onset of something like the MCU, which, takes the serial continuity, huge universe kind of storytelling dynamic of comics and moves it into the cinematic space. And also with the rise of serial storytelling in what we used to call television, but now exists in this indeterminate space where you can tell a story that's multiple seasons. It could be a one-off, Watchmen type story. It can be, just a couple of seasons. It can be 30 minutes or 120 minutes from one episode to another. Like, you can tell the story that you want to tell for as long as it takes to tell it. And you have the budgets to do the storytelling you want to tell, that you want to engage in. And so in that context, I mean, lots of things about storytelling can and will change, because you're not beholden to the same boundaries, whether those boundaries are time-based or are advertiser-based or are FCC-based or, whatever the boundaries, Comics Code, all these boundaries that used to constrain storytelling, they're gone or they are eroding. There'll be new boundaries, right, of some kind at some point. But right now there's kind of anything goes, when it comes to telling these stories, as long as there's an audience for it. And that audience no longer has to be mass. It no longer has to be everybody in order to make these viable stories to tell. So how does the villain evolve in that marketplace? I don't think we're ever, except for maybe like in moments of nostalgia, going to go back to white hat, black hat. I just don't see us regressing in terms of the kind of stories that we consume as a culture, that we go back to that as a norm, unless it's something that is self-conscious, self-consciously nostalgic. But whether villains, we continue to see movies like Joker, shows like Gotham, things like that I think, could play itself out, in favor of some other treatment that we haven't really considered yet.
Yeah, no, that's a good point about how the focus on villains now may, in some sense, be overdetermined by other factors like streaming media and relaxation of codes and stuff like that. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, well, all of the things that simply thinking about the supervillain brings up. And, in this book, as we start to wrap up our interview here, it brings up a lot of nuanced arguments and questions and raises a lot of issues. But I'm sure after you published this, there were things that you either regretted not putting in or struck you as, wow, that's interesting. Maybe that's for the next time I deal with villains. So yeah, I'm curious if you could say a little bit about what maybe didn't you get to tackle, or you simply hope that you or other scholars will be able to tackle in future work. What else is lying out there that looks appealing to you from a scholarship point of view?
I think that villain studies is wide open. We're just scratching the surface with the Supervillain Reader in terms of the depth and breadth of the study of villainy in all its forms and the supervillain in general. It's wide open, and I'd love to see more of an in-depth look at specific villains, whether they be Thanos or Michael Myers, Darth Vader. More study and critical theory and ideas floating around that critically analyze the role that these villains have played in our popular culture.
And I guess just, in terms of the things that, aren't in the book or aren't emphasized as much in this volume as we might have liked. I mean, obviously, it's a pretty long book, and there were still many things that we didn't get to. And that was either a conscious decision. Like, we didn't talk a lot about Joker in this book because we just had done a Joker book. And that seemed a bit like overkill, but also just as a function of what people came to us with. We tried to hit as many bases as we could. And one of the benefits of doing both new work and reprinted work is that we could curate that a little more than maybe we normally could, right? Because it really is, when you do an edited volume, a lot of times the end result is a function as much of what comes in as it is your skill or approach as an editor. This was a new experience for us to do reprints. We'd not done that. I don't think you had done that. I certainly hadn't done reprints before in a collection. Even given that, there were still characters and theoretical traditions and so on that certainly we only mentioned, kind of in passing. Thanos is a big one just because, Avengers, the last few Avengers movies were the air we've been breathing for the 4 years it took us to put this thing together. And so I guess if I were encountering the book right now as somebody, even not necessarily even an academic, but just somebody who's interested in the character trope, I would write an Amazon review like, they don't even talk about Thanos. Like, 1 star. You know?
Careful, don't give people ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, and of course, you know, we have a piece about Magneto, but Magneto, you know, certainly could have a book all his own. And there's just so many, you know, decisions, explicit or implicit, that are made in the composition of a study like this, that, you know, you just can't cover it all. And I guess, you know, our charge to anybody who reads the book and hopefully enjoys it, but also says, man, I really wish they'd written about X, like, go write about X, you know. And we hope to read that in a journal or in your book or edited collection in a couple of years, and eventually, you know, sort of build up this subfield so that we can understand these characters better, because they are, to some degree, they're going to be with us for forever. We need to understand them because they do say something about who we are as people, either in terms of how we identify with them, or how we write them, or how we deploy them, or how we cast them. All of those are decisions that say something about who we are as a culture.
Mm-hmm. Related to that, are there pitfalls that you've seen, maybe junior scholars or maybe students or whoever it is, where they're taking on a character that's popular, that's very popular, whether that's Joker, Batman, Superman, or what have you? My hesitation earlier, like as a scholar, was, you know, if I wanted to write about Batman, what hasn't been said about Batman, right? It took me a very long time until I thought I had something new to say. So obviously you don't want to repeat yourself, but especially when we're talking about pop culture, no one's going to be the first to write about villains or to write about whatever it is that interests them, because these are huge and very popular entities. That said, what are some of the directions that you think scholars should go and should make sure to avoid?
One thing I might say there is, you might start from a different place and then eventually discover that one of these characters is helpful for helping you understand that thing. So the piece that's reprinted in our book in the Supervillain Reader that I wrote was from a collection on superheroes from a few years ago, and I wrote that piece as a doctoral student, and it was about how superhero characters sort of help us understand the relationship between kind of moral absolutes and then moral imperatives as deployed in practical situations. And I used E.P. Thompson's notion of the moral economy to kind of unpack that. And I came to that piece through my critical theory class, and I was really interested in the moral economy. I didn't intend to write a superhero paper. I wanted to write a paper where I utilized that and kind of engage the theory of the moral economy. And I just happened to have been, you know, Spider-Man, I think 2, had come out that year. And I saw, you know, many of those issues reflected in the way that film was composed. And I was like, I kind of see it in Hellboy, and I kind of see it in Catwoman, which came out all within around the same year. And so that's how, you know, so I didn't start out wanting to write about Catwoman. And by the way, never write anything about Catwoman, because you will have to watch that film many times. And I would not wish that on anybody. That was a bad part of that decision. But so I guess I'm saying, find something that you're interested in writing about, that a superhero character, supervillain character will help you unpack, and then you come to it with an angle that probably isn't out there yet, as opposed to, I want to write something about Batman. Let me, you know, comb through all the things that have been written about Batman and figure out and find an angle for that. That seems to be a less interesting and a less productive path.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. Last question. What are you guys, if you care to share, setting your sights on now? You've done a number of collaborative things, and maybe you're going to do another. I assume you're going to do another one, but maybe you're going to go your separate ways for a little in terms of the work that you're doing. But what's on the horizon in terms of scholarship or focus?
Well, right now, we don't have another project lined up for the two of us. We're not going our separate ways, but, you know, we've been either working on or promoting a book together for about 10 years now. And I think we're both ready to just take a minute and think about what our next move might be there. I'm working on a piece right now on Game of Thrones tourism in Northern Ireland. And hopefully that will be finalized pretty soon, and that'll come out Well, I guess I can't say which journal until it's official. But anyway, that's what I'm working on right now. And then at some point, I'd like to work on a project where I put some of this work I've been doing on Game of Thrones tourism in conversation with my previous work on Lord of the Rings tourism in New Zealand, maybe in a monograph form, and to sort of put that in conversation with current discourses around travel and scarcity and climate change and instability and things like that, and nostalgia. So that's a lot, and it's all fairly cloudy, I think, for me at this point. But that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Currently, I have a co-edited volume on The Punisher that's under peer review at the moment.
Cool.
Who are you working on that with?
With Matt McHenry, Alicia Goodman, and Ryan Cassidy.
Great. Congrats.
Well, we'll see what the reviewers say.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I mean, both of you have been doing some really interesting work, and I really appreciate you speaking to me today about this one in particular, the Supervillain Reader. So, Robert, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been great.
Well, thanks for having us, Chris. You're doing good work, so we appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thank you.
As always, thank you so much to everyone for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I hope everybody is as healthy and happy as they can possibly be during this time. I know it's a challenge, and my thoughts are with people who are dealing with hardships, and that's a lot of people right now. Don't forget to check out tinap.org to see book recommendations and what's coming up next. I really do appreciate it if people could retweet, repost, send messages, send thoughts, comments. I'm going to keep doing this despite having 4 dogs that vie for my attention while I'm in my home office working and just seeing crazy things that really does seem like a supervillain plan unfolding right before our eyes, and I hope we can all get through this together. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.